Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Rod Stryker, also known as Yoga Rupa. Rod is widely considered one of the West's leading authorities on yoga, tantra, and meditation. He has taught for more than 35 years, is the founder of Para Yoga, and author of The Four Desires, Creating a Life of Purpose, Happiness, Prosperity, and Freedom. Rod has contributed to countless wellness publications and recently launched one of the most comprehensive online yoga teacher trainings in the world. At the forefront of integrating ancient yogic wisdom into a broad array of modern-day applications, he is a thought leader and mentor to thousands of Para Yoga practitioners and hundreds of teachers throughout the world. Rod lives in Colorado with his wife and his 4 children. So hello, Rod. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jacob.
It's a real pleasure to have you today. I've been really enjoying preparing for this interview, reading some of your writings from Huffington Post and also watching some of your videos online. And so I'm really excited to kind of explore some of the things that inspired me when I was reading and watching you. So, but first, before we get started, I'd love to just hear about your story and you've had a long, obviously, trajectory of your own practice. So I would love to hear about the story that kind of led you to yoga and maybe some of the key moments in your own evolution of your practice.
Well, that might take up our whole hour, but I'll try and keep it. I'll try and hit the highlights.
All right, sounds good.
I think the place to begin is pain, the very thing that brings most of us to these wisdom traditions.
Right.
Literally, one of the more important scriptures of the Tantric Hatha Yoga tradition says, for those who have been scorched by the 3 fires, which are physical pain, mental, emotional pain, and or spiritual pain. And, I don't know, some combination of those 3 probably were at play when at the age of 19, I discovered yoga. And it was not, I didn't know what I was looking for, to be honest with you. I just, someone suggested it, and I didn't have anything else at my disposal that I thought could address what I was feeling. And I did my first class by myself. I actually did it out of Lie Down Yoga, and which was Iyengar's classic book of Hatha Yoga.
Right.
The third pose, I had an epiphany, and I was experiencing something more expansive, more profound than in all my years of study of philosophy and psychology. I was a junior in college at the time, and a philosophy major, and even before doing those poses, I don't know what possessed me, but I did in fact read his introduction, which is a really quite extraordinary glimpse at a kind of very classical but still profound purvey of the yoga tradition, from really the Raja Yoga tradition, we'll call it, where the full feature of what yoga could be and is. And there's something on that first page that now, nearly 40 years later, it still sticks with me. And there was a moment he writes about, I think it's the second or third paragraph, and the term introduces a term called yukta. And yukta, he describes as, in order to understand the universe, one must first interface with the universe within oneself. And when one does, then one understands and relates to the rest of the universe. And one who achieves that is a yukta. And that was a very compelling point, the idea that rather than trying to understand the universe by looking outward, I could possibly achieve it by looking inward. I think stuck with me. Over the next 9 months, I practiced pretty consistently because I had some profound experiences, very profound. And just in short, seeing that I was more than my body, experiencing a kind of transcendent awareness, we'll say. And then wind the tape forward. I was living in Denver. I left college in my junior year. I'd been doing yoga on my own for about 9 months. I moved back to Los Angeles, which was where I grew up. Attended my first conducted yoga class, and there I practiced for almost 2 years Kundalini yoga. So that was an interesting kind of interface, because it began to really introduce me to yoga as a means to really quickly transform and move energy as such. And the quality or the effect of that, we could say it was an introduction to the science of spiritual experience through energy, skillful use of energy. Let's put it that way. And then, again, the next kind of hallmark point was meeting my first teacher as such. And I met Alan Finger and later his father, who became my guru, Manny Finger. And Manny had studied with three extraordinary masters of the previous century. Shivananda was actually Yogananda was his first teacher. Shivananda of Rishikesh was his second. And then this tantric mystic, his name was Shuddhananda Bharti, who had been a tantric hermit. And he was this, Manny became this, I would say, a funnel of these three streams of profound knowledge and teaching. And I began then to really enter into what is pretty unique in this day and age, which is, I would say, a discipleship, kind of under the tutelage of Manny for the most part, and then additional guidance from Alan. And we'll wind the tape up forward again about 17, 18 years later. Manny was nearing the end of his life, and we had a moment, a kind of meeting of our minds, and he gave me his blessing to find another teacher. He was now 97. And I began a 2-year search and kind of looked high and low, and even outside of the yoga tradition, to be honest with you. And then I found Pandit Rajmani Tugunayat, who's the head of this Himalayan Institute, successor to Swami Rama. And it was almost upon, I shouldn't say when I first met him, because he was teaching in a very large group setting. And I thought, he's extremely knowledgeable, but he's not got the Shakti, the power that I was accustomed to in my experiences with Manny. But then we sat down. We had an occasion to be one-on-one for a little bit, and I realized that I had spent 20 years preparing to meet him. Wow. And that was about 17 years ago. So that's the history, and there's a lot to fill in, but in a sense, it's been, I'll let you follow up from there.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a beautiful story. And there's a couple questions that I have related to your story. And I'll ask sort of maybe the lighter one first. You've ended up in, and this sort of came to me before we got on the call today, just kind of randomly because, I live in New York City, you live in Colorado. These two places couldn't be any more different. And so when I'm seeing pictures of you on your website meditating next to the mountains, I think about kind of the relationship between sadhana and the context of where we live. And as of course we know, every place has a certain Shakti. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on how kind of location or place has contributed to your own experience of the practice, if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, first I think I should preface it by saying that I paid my dues. I discharged my duty in Los Angeles for 40 years. Okay. We moved here about 14 years ago. Okay. And, I do think you bring up an interesting point in as much as there are really two pulls that we have throughout our life. And it's vital, I think, for anyone's well-being that we recognize that there are actually two areas where we necessarily must investigate or must explore if we're ultimately going to realize the potential of who we are and why we're here. So number one is that duty thing and discharging duty and dharma and our responsibilities. Cities are powerful places to do that, and certainly there's an array of opportunities to do it in cities. And I am thankful. One, that of my time in Los Angeles. Of course, I'm also thankful I'm not in Los Angeles anymore. A lot. But I would say that, it was a pretty dynamic place. And in a way, I think I could not be me in the sense of who I am creatively and otherwise in terms of my life, my career, my family, if it wasn't for my time in Los Angeles, as well as I'm even going to credit a lot of my expertise as a teacher comes from the kind of incubational cauldron that was LA, and being able to translate what I was learning and experiencing in my yoga into a language that Los Angelinos could understand. Mm-hmm. And so that was really extraordinarily vital. I would say, that, and I'm really glad I did it in the order I did it. Now I'm in the I think it's fair to admit I've entered in the latter half of my life, and I'm glad I'm here. I wouldn't want to do it the other way around, in essence, because that early interface and learning how to stand in front of people and people who may not necessarily understand the value of these teachings and be able to articulate it to them and excite them and interest them and inspire them to move into these teachings and practices. That really was not an invaluable time in my time in LA. Jacob, the question of sadhana, I said something in a recent seminar to some of my more advanced students, and I said, and I think, and I'll mention it in this context because a lot of them said afterwards that it was very meaningful to hear it. And as it relates to you living in in New York, for example, and feeling maybe somewhat a little more constrained in terms of your sadhana and maybe the effects of the environment, I said, look, the fact is that rather than judging the fact that we can't always be doing the ideal amount of practice if we're in city life and the impact, for instance, of maybe the distractions in a city on our practice. What I said is, look, the tradition is not saying you need to practice 3 to 4 hours every day necessarily. I mean, that would be wonderful. But what the tradition says is that you take 1 or 2 periods of the year to do extremely intense practice. And then the samskara, the impression that makes, stays with you for the rest of the year. And so what I would say is for people who are still discharging their duties and living in a city and feeling the pull of the world away from the pull of their souls, for example, that at least twice a year you do something that really is dedicated to deepening your practice in a significant way. And especially if it's twice a year, it has longevity in life and supports you then when you're doing the work in the world, so to speak.
I see. So that's really useful. So let's go a little bit deeper into that. So two times a year now, are you talking about something like a retreat setting where you would go away and meditate, do your practice very intensively? Is that something that you think you would suggest leaving the city for people that are living in, major cities where there are such things as, speed and distraction?
Yeah. Yeah.
You would. Okay. And then
I would say, yes, if you can do something, I mean, that's the ideal scenario, get away, because it's not to say that you can't do an intense practice at home. It's just that you have so many associations to the worldly pulls around you. So yeah. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a led retreat, depending on your level of self-discipline.
Right.
Just disappearing and loosening your connections to the internet and texting and the rest. Ideally, you have bad cell reception wherever you're going to go do that kind of practice.
Well, and I know this is kind of detailed, but I think maybe it's useful for those who haven't heard this suggestion before. But are you suggesting something like a week or 10 days? Is a long weekend enough?
I would say a week minimum.
Okay.
A week to 10 days. Now, again, just to create, if we're going to make that prescription for people, understand that if you do a 10-day practice at home, that instead of meditating for 20 minutes, you push it to an hour.
Yeah.
Or you give yourself 30 days, or ideally, and now neuroscience is really behind this old idea of sadhana as a 40-day thing. Neuroscience is saying that it takes about 40 days to establish new neural pathways. So the old practice was 40 days, but imagine now twice a year not leaving the city, but go ahead and say, okay, so instead of what I've been squeezing, what I've been managing to do as a personal practice is I take 20 minutes to half an hour. I would say that's probably, we fall into a pattern of doing just enough to ameliorate the pressures of our life, to take care of our stressors, but we're not actually deepening our life as a seeker. And so you say, okay, for 40 days, I'm going to do an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and 10 minutes. Or the first 10 days, it's a graduated practice, and you build up to an hour and a half or 2 hours of meditation. I think that's the way to do it. So minimum a week, ideally 40 days. But if you're leaving for 40 days, few of us can afford the time off that much. So at least if you're away for a week to 10 days, but if you can manage a 40-day practice twice a year, it will have a profound residual effect for the rest of the year.
Wow. And then just one last question on this. Are there ideal times of year where this makes sense, I don't know, astrologically or in terms of Ayurveda principles that you would suggest, or is it kind of whatever works for you?
I would say there's two answers. There's an ideal time and a second best or ideal time. First is pre-spring is really ideal, and round fall, early fall would be ideal. If you could manage twice a year. Those are profound times of change. Mm-hmm. I would also then offer the second best time is any time you can do it.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so that's great. I just thought I wanted to ask some questions on that because I think that's it. We haven't talked about kind of the practical side of doing something, incorporating something like that into your sadhana, and I think it would be really useful for people that maybe haven't heard that before.
Sure.
So then the other thing I wanted to ask about, and this is actually something that that I had really been inspired by in one of your talks that you did. I believe it was for the one of Wanderlust speakeasies, and you talk about tradition, and as many of us will not be surprised to hear, tradition generally has become not as fundamental to people's practice as perhaps it was, and even we might even say there's been a kind of negative association with tradition in some way by all of the recent events, especially as it relates to certain kind of guru abuses or things that tend to make tradition look, I don't know, backward or hierarchical or whatever, negative connotation people have been associating it with. But you go into a really interesting conversation about how we have all of these in almost any domain of expertise in our lives. There's a tradition of cumulative knowledge that informs what we do, and then with spirituality, it's sort of like, anything that your little heart desires, that kind of salad bar spirituality effect. So I wanted to kind of go deep into this and talk about why this is so significant and why tradition is maybe start with kind of a cultural diagnosis, why you think it's people are becoming less interested in it, and then if you want to move into what it could do for us as we kind of maybe find a new way to appropriate tradition in our practice.
Well, this is a big one, but it is one of my favorites. And at the same time, I also understand going into it that there is a lot of, let's say, prejudgment one way or the other. I think maybe in that talk, I even mentioned, look, for people who've been exposed to the light of tradition and had a meaningful and helpful experiences of it, it's invaluable.
Right.
And at the same time, our perception of it is, and our association to it is, at the same time, you easily make the case that people say, look, I've gotten stuff out of yoga, or I've gotten stuff out of meditation, and I've never been part of a tradition. I don't need a tradition. So there's a lot of a lot of us are preloaded for a judgment based on our experience about it. And I don't know that we'll convince anyone otherwise, but you've already made a bit of the case around the fact that there is nothing in our society that isn't built off of previous knowledge. And, you and I are communicating via technology that, the technology that we take for granted, whether it's our phones or our iPhone, whether it's our phones or our computers, et cetera, is all built on generations and generations of development and science. I'm always a little, I'm really cynical of people who deny the idea of science as accumulated knowledge, and the idea that 99% of the scientists in the world, for example, have a feeling about climate change. And you have a lot of politicians who are, on the other hand, saying, no, there is no such thing, and all these scientists are wrong. And I said, well, why don't you may be right, but if you're right, would you be willing to give up everything else these scientists have developed, i.e. your phone, i.e. electricity, harnessing electricity, lights, and at that point, the argument would be mute. But I'll stay away from partisanship, and I'll just sweep back here into your question. I think, number one, there's an understandable kind of kickback. But I think before I make the case to defend it or, suggest people get a little softer around those boundaries around tradition, I do think, just taking the big picture view, that in the West, there really is there's very little modeling that even can parallel the relationship to teacher or knower tradition. Mm-hmm. In other words, 100 years ago, at least in the modern day, that's the case. So 100 years ago, the idea that you had a mentee, if you were a blacksmith, you didn't just go to a trade school. You interfaced with a blacksmith, someone who had done it for 20, 30, 50, 60 years, and whose whole life is integrated to being a blacksmith or a carpenter. So there's very little of that kind of mentorship in our lives anymore. Mm-hmm. And I think that is part of why there's kind of a lack of reference to that point. People have made the case this is part of the challenge around like inner city youths, that they don't have role models, in essence, to kind of look ahead to their life as to what it could be, where we see and experience something that's highly functional, that gives us meaning and purpose in our life, that gives us a sense of direction and a sense of embodiment and integration. And so, the ancient model of mentorship was you actually spent time with the mentor. You saw him with his family. You saw him or her, whatever the case may be. You saw them interact both with the craft and the world. And if I can, just step back for a moment, I will tell you that having met my first guru, my first teacher at the age of 20, my eyes were open wide as a student. I was a front row kind of student, but at the same time, I watched closely and learned about how he was a grandfather, how he parented, how he lived away from teaching. And he taught me, in essence, as much about life and myself, not in the context of this, of teaching about philosophy. I saw, to quote a term, embodied philosophy. Mm-hmm. And if I can plug you, if that's all right. But it was really significant, So I really want to make the case for that. The second thing I want to say is that I find in the West, because we don't have necessarily modeling around mentorship, what happens is the pendulum has a tendency to swing to the extremes in the West, which is that we are either wildly independent and resist learning, resist kind of sublimating our own will and watching someone grow, watching someone who has grown, who's grown beyond our current station in life, whether that's intellectually, emotionally, psychologically. And we want to do it ourselves. We are this kind of do-it-yourself culture, highly independent. I can do it. We celebrate individuality. And at the same time, the pendulum has a tendency to swing radically the other way, which is a radical codependence, a radical dependence, where we lose our sense of individuality and completely submit to this authority figure. There really isn't a kind of middle ground that exists where these traditions actually have survived for millennium. Now, it's not to say that in India, for instance, you go to many parts of India, or that there are not popular yogis or yoga or spiritual celebrities in India who get the kind of blind devotion from Indians. That does exist. Mm-hmm. But if one exercises some discernment, you see in India and the East in general, you see a celebration of individuality and self-reliance in the midst of deep respect and reverence for those who embody wisdom, and not just the light of wisdom that we find in the formal teachings, but the light of wisdom of living those teachings over decades in one's lifetime. And that's what I think makes it harder for Westerners, Americans, if you will, to kind of find what that middle line is between self-reliance and at the same time feeling served by something that has been time-tested, knowledge-based tradition embodied through an individual.
Do you think that has something to do with kind of the boundary being blurred, or the kind of, I don't know, the word is escaping me, but the mixture of, or the influence of our own kind of Judeo-Christian background on our perception of our experience in these traditions? Like, do you think that's part of the reason why, because there's something within the Judeo-Christian tradition that might ask for a kind of self-subservience that then gets translated unconsciously into our experience?
I don't think it's wrong to offer that as part of the dynamic of what we're talking about, what the challenges are. But I'm going to change the direction of your question and answer it differently. And I think in part what it really has to do with the fact that there's a fundamental misunderstanding around the idea of what these teachings reveal at the end. The realization of the promise of so many of these teachings. We all have some general assumptions about them, and fundamentally, they're wrong. And so what that means is that if we have a fundamental assumption about where it can go, I think what unfolds from that is that people assume, because they have this understanding where they can go, that they can get there themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the mistake. So, and again, I wouldn't be surprised if what I'm saying starts to kind of creates resistance or a little dissonance in people who might be listening to it.
That's my favorite kind of conversation. So
okay, great. But here's the piece that I think is critical, and that is that fundamentally, where these end, or where these teachings, like the culmination of the realization of the end of what these teachings are, is where each of us disappears. In other words, everything that we know about ourselves has to literally be demolished in order to get to the end of, in order to get to that rich, profound, sublime terrain that is the realization of these teachings.
Right.
Therefore,
sorry,
go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, well, that would be profoundly challenging for people in a culture that is saying that the very center of your being is your own egoic identity. It's like every cultural condition that we have is telling us to find ourself as a kind of, nomadic, separate self that has all of these different qualities that are uniquely different from yours, and so on and so forth. So it's what you're offering, what the tradition is offering is profoundly frightening for people. It would seem
it's that, and then it's also understanding that someone needs to lead you, or something needs to lead you to this place where you intellectually, emotionally, psychologically can't get to.
Right.
And now, if I again, just to kind of circle back, so we were really being clear, if I assume that I can get there by myself, and it's really just a trade-off of, I can get there by myself, or I can get there by myself with some help from somebody, then I'd rather just get there by myself, for all the reasons you mentioned, all of the, bad examples of teachers that have come along, and there's countless versions of it.
Yeah.
But what I'm suggesting is you can't get there by yourself, because you can't lead yourself someplace you've never gone before.
Yeah.
And now, but if I have the assumption I can get there, I opt for going there by myself. And it's not to say there haven't been individuals in history that have gotten there by themselves. There have been, but here's the case I want to make, and why it becomes even more relevant in this day and age, and that is that those that did, so, who knows about Christ's lost years and what happened between 16 and 36, and did he have a guru? Did he get to India? I don't even want to speculate on that one, but we do have a few examples Ramana Maharishi, for example, is one that people often like to cite as kind of achieving enlightenment at a very young age. But just so everyone knows, this wasn't like he wasn't reading the newspaper, or he didn't take a little afternoon walk and then ask, who am I? He literally essentially took the position of dying for about 7 to 9 months and continued to ask himself. He disappeared. Parents couldn't find him. He was hiding unseen for months, posing this question to himself. And so I think the challenge that most of us face in this day and age is that there is so fundamentally, our mental capacities have become weakened, our memory, and the traditions are very clear that memory plays a vital part in enlightenment. In other words, every stage of unfoldment has to be deeply retained in order for the next stage to be awakened. So imagine now, most people don't remember 4 phone numbers, let alone the subtle states of consciousness that unfold in ever deepening stages of meditation. So our mental capacities have weakened. Our distraction levels are off the charts. Yep. And in general, there's this kind of fundamentally we're breaking down the fabric that needs to be intact for this experience of the whole self. And that has a lot to do with our modern ills and technology and the society as a whole. So I don't think there are many individuals who have the incredible amount of discipline it will take. Listen, Buddha, who had practiced it for a lifetime, and then he sits under the tree and says, I'm not leaving. Mm-hmm. Now, it took him 49 days. I'm not leaving till I attain it. Took him 49 days straight of practice. Mm. I mentioned, if you could squeeze in a week, twice a year, that would be great. And maybe you could do it for 2 hours a day. Well, he did it nonstop, and it took him 49 days after years of preparation leading up to it. So all in all, what I'm suggesting is we need guidance. Now, and last thing I'll say is, and I think I should also qualify first and simply say, I've heard all the bad stories. I know all the bad. I've been in this world for a long time, so I'm all too familiar with them. Yeah. But I've never had the experience. To my blessing, and why I get to kind of be talking about this in the way I am today, is that I've had 2 gurus, and both have been incredibly moral, ethical, balanced, whole human beings. Nothing on the side, no kind of Wizard of Oz scenario, and that is they're one thing when they're teaching, they're another thing behind the curtain. And so I have my own prejudice around this. I've seen it in a functional way. I've been given that example. I try and embody it to the best of my ability to my students. So there's a last piece there's a last piece to this tradition thing, and that is this idea of if you will, Guru Shakti, or Parampara Shakti, maybe is a better word, which is that something tangible, not material, but tangible, an experiential truth gets passed from teacher to teacher. Mm-hmm. And moving into the proximity of it, again, within the framework of someone being healthful and integrated and whole themselves and having the right intentions, there is something in that environment that enriches the journey to this world that is not known by the mind, but is in fact the self, the truth. And that's that final piece, if you will. And there's some more things about tradition we could speak about, but there is something, there's a presence in that. Mm-hmm. And I would say that is as real as having a teacher teach you, ancient wisdom. Yeah. And so it comes alive there. Yeah, wow, there's so much richness that you've offered there. And I just want to ask one last question, because I think you'd made clear where we are going. And then you mentioned before that many of the fundamental assumptions of where we're going are wrong. But unless I missed it, I don't know if we actually said what those fundamental misconceptions are. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that. Like, what are the fundamental misassumptions about where we're going? You mean where we're going if we follow the wisdom of the traditions? Yes.
Yeah, because you said that the fundamental assumptions are generally wrong. So I'm wondering what those fundamental assumptions are.
Well, I mean, where I would begin would be to suggest, first of all, that there's a general sense of where we can wind up is where the promise of these traditions lead us is something more than stress release.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
No, so a lot of people go to yoga class, for example, and I know we're talking in a way, it's a larger conversation than just yoga, but a lot of people go to yoga class, and right before the bell starts, the class begins, the bell rings, the class starts, we're texting and we're doing our worldly stuff. We do the class, whatever the class may be. We do the flow. We experience what we experience. We do some shavasana. And right afterwards, we pick up our phone and we resume that conversation we were having right before. Now we feel a little more clear. Maybe we feel a little more patient. Maybe that night we sleep better. Maybe the next day our back and neck and feel a little better than it did. Now, a lot of people's assumption is it doesn't get better than that.
Right. That's
it. It's just somehow a slightly improved version of what it was before I did that practice. Mm-hmm. And I would say that now speaking in the yoga world, again, we're just misinformed. The expectation of what it can reveal if we dedicate ourselves to it is really low. We fundamentally set the bar so low, and that because we don't have a more a grander sense of the possibility of what these revelations over time build us toward, we assume that's as good as it gets. Yeah. So why do I need a teacher? Why do I need someone who's steeped in tradition to get me there? I got there. Yeah. So again, that's a misguided sense of what the target, as it were, is. And then, we can talk about, listen, one of the great sages of the yoga tradition, and perhaps the seminal sage, was Patanjali. Mm-hmm. Patanjali writes this amazing treatise, and somehow it gets subverted in the modern age in the West into like it's 8 limbs. My God, that is such a minuscule piece in the totality of that body of knowledge. So one of the things that's really intriguing is that he talks about samadhi. So this state where that starts to unfold as our mind starts to become more quiet. Well, he doesn't talk about samadhi in a general way. He goes as far as to say there are 9 stages of samadhi. 9 stages of samadhi, yeah. Starting with bliss. So a lot of students assume that when mind gets quiet and they get a glimpse of bliss, that they've reached the end.
Right.
Well, Patanjali tells us that's the beginning. Mm. So again, this could be a conversation just about all of the ways that we've been misinformed. Our expectations are far too low about what this means, about what the implications of following like a systematic process guided by a knowledgeable teacher, where that leads us, yeah. And what is possible.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that about the kind of health and wellness appropriation of the tradition. Uh-huh. I've talked about that in another interview with another interviewee, and I think it's really important because you're right to note that it's we've really anesthetized the tradition from its more radical aspect, and because people are made uncomfortable by that, and they associate it with religion, which people are uncomfortable with, blah blah blah. But in general, the end of the tradition has been kind of distorted in most people's view to be, has something to do with just getting less stressed and reducing anxiety, and that's sort of the end of it. Yeah. So thank you for bringing that up.
Sure.
So now I want to shift gears a little bit. That's been a really fascinating conversation. I'm so glad we went on so long about tradition. I think it's awesome. And you wrote a book called The 4 Desires. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. I first wanted to know just what your motivation was for writing the book, and then if you want to kind of go into what the 4 desires are.
Well, the short version of it is that a vital piece of the yoga tradition is this aspect of self-understanding. In the yoga, in yoga language, it's svadhyaya, so self-study, self-examination, and we should understand that this is really ultimately a twofold process of one, having relationship to our higher self and beginning to study that, having really beginning to be informed and learn from the very place we've kind of been talking around, which is, who am I when my mind is still? Who am I when I become gender free or genderless, beyond race, beyond sexual persuasion? Who is that? Who am I in the end? So number one is understanding the higher self, and number two is understanding the lower self. And honestly, I about 15 years ago, when the work that would become the book began, I really found that on the one hand, I found yoga teachers and dedicated yoga students incredibly capable of entering into a place of stillness and calm. But wow, man, I saw some really unhappy people.
Yeah.
And deeply unfulfilled creatively, or in light of their relationships or their career. And yet they could kind of do a bunch of poses, exhaust their nervous system to the point where they would then just be in bliss once again. And then kind of the pattern would repeat. And, I would see these conversations over the years, because by that point I had been in yoga for 25 years or so. And I found one of the most depressing social experiences of my life were yoga potlucks. The yoga potluck scene it quickly moved away from anything about creativity, relational fulfillment, breaking out of limited thinking, and it quickly became about poses or God knows what. So I really began to ask some questions. I began to go, and my questioning began to lead me back to some fundamental things I'd learned early in my discipleship, in my studies, around the soul, and the soul having two aspects. There's this, one of the most controversial things, at least 5, 10, 20 years ago, and probably today among serious yoga students, that you can bring up, is this question of desire. Yeah. And some contemplative and meditative traditions really, you really get people like angry and upset when you start talking like that. You have desires, and some desires are in fact legitimate. Desire seems to be, in some people's minds, anathema to spirituality. Now, the more you actually go deeper into the teachings, the more wrong that seems. Buddha himself made this distinction between righteous desires and non-righteous desires. Helpful, the Upanishads say Preya and Shreya, helpful desires and not helpful desires. And in the yoga tradition, Satya Kama means desire, Satya means truthful, elevated, and Asatya, so the opposite of. So again, righteous and non-righteous. And in essence, the soul, this fundamental teaching is the soul has these 4 core desires that it's like, my first teacher was the one who really made me think along these lines. And he was so, such an kind of profound example of the possibility of stepping into right desire. So what does that mean? It fundamentally means that our soul has these 4 innate desires. So one is the desire, the big one, the umbrella one, is the desire to fulfill your purpose. Mm-hmm. We each come here with a unique purpose. We have this capacity to fulfill that purpose. And unless we fulfill that purpose, we can't be happy. And that's maybe the essential teaching of the Bhagavad Gita, one of the core teachings of the scriptures of the yoga tradition, saying that unless you fulfill who you're meant to be, you can't be happy. And it even suggests that we struggle to fulfill our unique dharma rather than try and do the dharma of somebody else or someone else's dharma. It's better to do ours badly than someone else's well. And then from a sense of fulfilling our purpose, and by the way, there's a twofold piece of that. And just in brief, I would say number one purpose for all human beings is, 1, figure out how to stop suffering. Figure out how to stop suffering. We can, if we get to know ourselves better, both on the side of the light and the side of the dark. Indeed, that's the beginning. Number 2 part of purpose is not so much find the right career, but figure out what are the values you are meant to express through your relationships, through your work, And that is unique. I would say Da Vinci, for example, may have had a unique dharma different than Einstein, for just to say, two examples, or different than Gandhi. And yet each, not only were they in different, life trajectories, but there was something unique about their gift, their ray, how their uniqueness rayed out into the world. And every individual, I'm not saying we're all Da Vinci's, but every individual has a unique ray. And ideally we get clear about what that ray is. And that's really very much the heart of the book, The Four Desires, my book. So that's number one, is that we do that. We find out what our unique ray is, we honor it, and we step into I don't want to call it the struggle, we step into the invitation to expand ourselves into that ray. Mm-hmm. That is what living the purpose is. That's what living your dharma is all about. Number two desire is having the means to accomplish that purpose. And that means money, it means health, it means some level of security. And then go a little bit further, it's all the tools that you use. So Jacob, for example, you and I Skyping to make this recording and this thing available to others, that's a tool that you or I are using. And that word for all of those different aspects of the means to achieve our purpose is called artha. And then the third desire would be kama, which in this context means pleasure. And so the pleasure of sensuality and sexuality and friendship, beauty, art, music, whatever it is that gives us pleasure, gardening, dancing, making love. And I want to make the case, even before I introduce the fourth one, that all four desires are given equal weight in the tradition. The ancient texts actually call out all four. There's a scripture called Manu, which is one of the great dissertations on how we bring these teachings in the world. Manu is basically saying that the person who's only achieved the person who only fulfills one of the four is inadequate. Two of the four, moderate. Three of the four, superior. And four of the four, in other words, you are living and achieving all four desires. You are the example for all all beings. So what's the fourth desire? Is the desire maybe that is kind of the heart of what spiritual practice is all about, which is freedom and liberation and emancipation. It's the genesis of the seed of prayer and meditation, of yoga, of contemplation. And so imagine now, we'll step back from this in an ancient context and just say, look, what does all four look like? Wow, if I have freedom, a kind of spiritual richness in my life, I have some measure of pleasure, I have some measure of the means to accomplish the fourth or the first of the four, which was purpose. Man, we're talking about a complete life. And that teaching is so compelling to me, not just in the yoga world, that people, again, our expectations are low. Well, as long as I'm surviving, as long as I have a little less stress, as long as I can maybe sleep through the night, I got everything I need. And on deeper inspection, what we'll find is it's really when only these four are honored and fulfilled that we become who we're meant to be.
Yeah, I really love the many of these ideas you bring up, because it seems like what you're doing is drawing out really the life-affirming principles of the tradition, especially with regards to means and pleasure, because, it seems like, I don't know if you've encountered this, but I certainly have, where, yoga teachers or anybody who practices yoga has this idea that they aren't supposed to make money, that like making money is a bad thing. Yeah. And, there's some kind of like, Marxist kind of component to it. Not to, denigrate Marx, who's certainly a brilliant man. And then also pleasure. Pleasure is something that is also kind of uncomfortably held sometimes in some of our mindset. We think like, oh, we're supposed to kind of rise above pleasure, or pleasure is of the flesh, and we're trying to transcend that. And so it cultivates a kind of, I don't know, self or life negating idea of what the practice is about, and you really seem to be pushing against that in a way.
I guess I am, and it's not my main purpose, but indeed I've found it there. And the idea, first of all, my ability to actually enter into that dialogue and embrace those teachings and develop the idea in the course and the book and all that, really that has to do with me being schooled in Tantra, which doesn't make that distinction about, in fact, purposefully attempts to tear the wall down between spiritual fulfillment and worldly fulfillment. And so it is, in fact, couched in this core tantric philosophy. And, just to circle back to your point, not only does it create a judgment around those desires, it inherently creates conflict.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, I have kids, I have children, for example, but any yoga teacher has, children. To start to deny your kids their desires simply because you think desire is counterintuitive or counterintuitive to their spiritual welfare is going to make for a very unhealthy child.
Right.
And then yoga teachers, for instance, just denying their own sexuality, denying it in the context of, if I indulge and I make money, or I embrace the idea of pleasure, I'm ultimately making spiritual fulfillment more difficult. Mm-hmm. And that breeds such a kind of dichotomy within one's psyche.
Yeah.
That ultimately, it really does ultimately lead to stagnation. And if not just like this profound conflicted self-image. Mm-hmm. So the beauty is that my teachers completely discharged me of that idea, that notion. And the more you look at it, it's really interesting. The Rig Veda being the oldest spiritual scripture, essentially existent spiritual scripture on the planet, the thing ends asking us to walk together, to eat together, to celebrate one another in peace. And all of those profound rituals and teachings and some of the most esoteric spiritual knowledge ever revealed. And where it ends is, let's eat and walk and talk and be in peace.
Wow.
So this is not, I'm not being iconoclastic. I'm not a revolutionary. What I'm trying to do is, in fact, steep our modern application of these ancient traditions in the actual wisdom. Let's walk together. Let's talk together. Let's eat together and share the bounty of life. That's actually where it ends. Share the bounty of life together in peace.
That's amazing. So that's actually a good segue into the last thing I wanted to talk about, which I hope you're going to be okay with, because the reason why I'm asking this topic is because in one of your talks you mentioned that your least favorite topic is yoga and politics. And so I guess I wanted to start just by asking why that is. And then also in an election year like this, and you're talking about at the end of Rig Veda, it's talking about walk together, eat together, and celebrate each other. How is it hard to avoid conversations around the relationship between yoga and politics at a moment like this for you?
Well, until now, I've done a very good job.
Well, I apologize for that.
My distaste for that is, how do I put this nicely? The fact is that Republicans deserve to do yoga too. It should not be just the domain of liberalism.
Totally.
And people who are progressive in their worldview.
Yeah.
I'm also of the mind, as radical as it may seem in this day and age, that Democrats are not always right and Republicans are not always wrong, and vice versa.
Totally.
And then the other thing is, but going back to my first point, is I still find, in the end, if you ask me, in the end, I'm a seeker, and I try and really be a refuge for seekers. Yeah. As a teacher, I want to be a refuge for seekers. And I find that there's a certain bifurcation that has to happen, that if I become too political on a public level,
yeah,
that I will become less of a refuge for all those who might benefit from learning with me, or from the teachings, or really from the tradition I serve. Things have gotten so extreme that, I am not apolitical on a personal level at all.
Right.
Let's put it that way. And I have strong feelings about it. I consider myself very well informed, and so I definitely have views. But I try. It's interesting. My teacher, Pandit Rajmani Tuganayat, comes from, and I said that a little quickly. Pandit Rajmani Tuganayat comes from a lineage of all the eldest sons in his family, going back to the 15th century, were all either royal priests or royal yogis. They serve the kings, right? Mm-hmm. So he has, and he has 2 PhDs in philosophy and in Sanskrit studies, Allahabad University and Penn State. And when he became a disciple of his guru said, I will take you on as my student, but you have to promise me 3 things. You will not participate in religion, sectarian religion, politics, or astrology. I know I'm opening a big can of worms with that, but the point is that more than once I've wanted to get up on a soapbox and say something about it. And kind of maybe lend my political view, throw it out there. But I want to keep that gate open as much as possible. I've had extensive conversations with different organizations that have been born out of the yoga world, but who have a political tilt. And I said, I can only participate if it's nonpartisan.
Yeah.
And so for instance, Citizen Well, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but they're an amazing organization that really began to want to tap into the consciousness that is being developed in those in the health, wellness, yoga world, meditation world, of which, we spend billions of dollars. And there are some common views, like it would be better if more of us were healthy. It would be better if more of us were educated. It would be better if there was more social justice. It would be better. And so what are those things that we can find in common? Citizen Well is focused on it. It's why I've lent my name and voice to their organization, and yet it's managed to stay bipartisan. And it's better if more people vote, for example. Yeah. Period. Just get involved. So I've been tiptoeing this line pretty in trying to answer your question, but I have a feeling you want me to do something else.
No, I don't. No, actually, I love the way that you're approaching it, because that's sort of how I wanted to address it, is not by getting, not going into a predictable rant that might align with kind of democratic principles versus Republicans, which tends to be the position of most yogis, at least the ones that I come into contact with. But I think that it's that if we zoom out, that's sort of what I wanted to maybe address, is kind of the kind of dualistic narrative of partisanship, and how that narrative is dividing us, because it seems like if we are to take yoga philosophy seriously, we would need to be walking a line, something like what you're talking about, where we're trying to have a nonpartisan conversation. Because if we are wanting to walk together, eat together, we certainly can't be having this kind of good, evil, hero, villain kind of storyline completely shaping our perception of things.
Yeah, I really appreciate your point of view and you articulating that. And I think here's where I would say these practices are invaluable and where they come into play, where I would want them to come into play more completely in this conversation, in this world. Number one is the calm and clear thinking that yoga is meant to provide. Again, it's another thing of why yoga needs to be more than just the text conversation I was having before class, the same text conversation I had after class. Maybe I'm just a little calmer. I find myself, I'm typing faster because my mind is less cluttered. Mm-hmm. But the point is that, everything from, like, Brexit is an amazing example of the overt emotionalism around what should be carefully considered rational decisions. Mm-hmm. And I think the more emotional, the more stirred up we get. It's not to say we don't want people passionate. We want things to be important to people. Yeah. But to the extent that they cloud our thinking and we react emotionally instead of thoughtfully, and part of the emotionalism that concerns me is it will throw us to the extremes. Mm-hmm. This is when liberal, progressive activists become some of the angriest people on the planet.
Totally.
with the least amount of acceptance. Just a really quick anecdote. There's this a restaurant here on the West Coast. It's San Francisco and L.A. and Cafe Gratitude, very popular vegan jaunt. Well, about a year ago, the vegan owners came out and admitted or acknowledged that they had shifted their diet. They were now raising their own cattle, and they were eating beef. Well, they've gotten death threats for the last year from vegans. On the other hand, so I don't have to just portray the other side of the equation, but the idea of that we can also, the other issue for me is when our minds become either over-cluttered with information or we become overly swept up in emotionalism, we lose our capacity to nuance issues.
Yeah.
And that's my biggest concern, frankly. Da Vinci, one of my non-yogic gurus, we'll say, he said that one of the keys to life was the ability to live with dichotomy, contradiction. Mm-hmm. And so, on the one side we have Bernie people who absolutely won't vote for Hillary because there's no nuance there. There's no nuance in it. Yeah. Well, so and we have Republicans who are willing to throw their weight behind Trump, for example, because they don't have nuance.
Yeah.
So I just think the guiding light of yoga is a calm, tranquil mind. That's the foundation of it. That's, as I said earlier, that's just the beginning. And yet, if we don't have that, what do we have in a political conversation or in ultimately how we survey, the judgments we pass and our own power of discernment about what is to our best advantages for me as an individual and for us society and for the globe long, long, long into the future. So I do think yoga it is important that we consider it. On the other hand, I'll just say this, and it may contradict what I said earlier, and that is you can't completely separate yoga and politics, because yoga, if nothing else, after it starts to quieten the mind, awakens our conscience. And I'm not talking about good or bad as informed by others, but rather the guiding wisdom of our own inner voice and our own inner truth. And yoga is really ultimately meant to awaken the voice of conscience, and so that we best know how to respond to every moment. Now, the more our conscience is actually communicating to us, and part of our perspective, the more we have to give a damn about, the decisions that will shape the environment, education, health, women's rights, everything. All of those things, our voice of reason is going to begin to talk to us. So the third step after calm mind, awakening of conscience is you got to act on it.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, this has been so interesting, and you've given so much rich insight into so many things. So thank you so much, Rod. We're at the end of our time. And as we close, I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share where people can find you, for those that are new to your teachings, and anything that's coming up that you might want to share, workshops, retreats, teacher trainings.
I appreciate that. Sure. So you had mentioned earlier in the show where you introduced me, people can find me at Parayoga. It's PARAYOGA.com. Mm-hmm. And there's a bunch of offerings there, from meditation offerings and things like that. I also teach I'm one of the featured teachers on Yoga Glow, which is streamable yoga classes. I probably have 60, some of which are meditation, yoga nidra, probably more than 40 asana classes, and they get a pretty broad sense of all of those offerings, and really how to use the wisdom of yoga, I would almost say scientifically, certainly methodically, to create different effects. Mm-hmm. And then I'd also mention this teacher training platform, which is about as comprehensive a teacher training as there is. It's the essence of and the curriculum essentially that I was taught, and now that I am trying to pass on to others, so that really as we can become as sophisticated as possible as practitioners, informed by Tantra and Ayurveda and yoga. And people should stay tuned and stay in touch. And, what I say is, keep practicing and keep evolving. The main thing is find the practice that continues to help you expand and nurtures your life in the world, but also nurtures your life as a seeker.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
All right, Rod.
Thank you, Jacob. I appreciate it.
It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you again sometime soon. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We'll speak again soon.
Thanks again, Jacob.
All right, bye-bye. Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Rod Stryker. To learn more about Rod and his teachings, check out parayoga.com, P-A-R-A yoga.com, and you can also find him on Yoga Glow at yogaglow.com. Until next time, friends, namaste.